Hello there, and welcome back to the Court of Everything. Today we have Kris Karnauskas on the podcast. Kris is a fellow and associate professor at the University of Colorado Boulder and runs the Oceans and Climate Lab. His research focuses on atmospheric science and physical oceanography, and he worked with NASA from 2021 to 2024 in using satellite observations to project future sea level changes. He is also an avid trail and ultramarathon runner and author of the book Physical Oceanography and Climate, which was published in 2020. His research recently has shifted towards the Galapagos Islands in the Eastern Pacific. We talk Darwin, why the Galapagos Islands are so naturally rich and diverse, and although they're small, why they have such a heavy impact on the global atmosphere. If you like what you hear, please go ahead and follow Kris on X at OceansClimateCU, that's OceansClimateCU, and whilst you're already on X and Twitter, why not give us a follow at the CoPod, the COE pod. We also have Instagram and TikTok at CoPod, COE pod. Enjoy the episode. Okay, great. Well, Kris, thanks very much for joining. I really appreciate it. So the other day you were sitting in that talk and I was listening intently, and obviously the Galapagos Islands are renowned for their beauty and richness of wildlife. Darwin called it a little world in itself. You stated in the talk that the Galapagos archipelago has a profound effect on oceanography, ocean circulation. There was more, but you moved on before I could scribble it down. It basically had a profound effect on the global atmosphere. How does something so small have such a profound effect?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's certainly what caught my attention about the Galapagos early on in my career because typically I pay attention to much larger scale things in the climate system than a tiny little group of islands. What makes the Galapagos able to have such a outsized effect is really just comes down to its location on the equator. Um, most people have heard of El Nino before, and the answer to the question that you just asked is really kind of the same answer as what makes El Nino such a globally impactful phenomenon that has effects that reverberates all around the planet, not just right there within the tropical Pacific, but it's on the equator. It's in a relatively warm part of the ocean, and the atmosphere responds pretty abruptly to any sort of changes in the temperatures of the ocean in that region. And another thing that's really special about the Galapagos is actually that they sit right on the equator. And that's really key because, the Coriolis effect, which is this sort of global phenomenon that causes winds and ocean currents to veer one way in the northern hemisphere and a different way in the southern hemisphere. Some people think that this is what makes you know, the water spin in a certain direction when you flush the toilet. We don't have to go down that road, but that's a little too small to be affected by the Coriolis effect. It's kind of um, it's a misconception, but on larger scales, that's definitely true. And because this flips its directionality on either side of the equator, like in the northern and southern hemisphere, it makes the dynamics of how the ocean circulation behave very unique right there on the equator. And that's right where the Galapagos sit. So there's just a lot of things, a lot of interesting twists in the climate going on right in that particular location.
Yeah, I guess you can put your hand and you can swish the water any way you want to in a bath or not a toilet. Don't put your hand in a toilet, and that's the unhygienic.
That's
Uh,
not what we want people to take away from this podcast.
more than welcome to try. They're more than welcome to try. Uh, we've mentioned two things there that we're going to get onto. One's El Nino, and the other one is the Coriolis effect. So the Coriolis effect is the idea that the Earth's rotation deflects air and water, and so it's in the northern hemisphere, the wind deflects to the right, southern hemisphere deflects to the left, and that's why we see storms in the northern hemisphere swirl anti-clockwise, and the southern it's clockwise. And so the ocean,
Exactly.
yeah, exactly. So the ocean circulates in the same way, I assume.
Yeah, it's there's parts of the big parts of the ocean circulation that don't circulate in that way. It's more you want to think of the Coriolis effect as something that is always tugging on everything to go in a certain direction, but there's other things involved too. So like the great subtropical gyres, in the northern hemisphere, for example, they flow in a certain, I'm talking about this large scale things that take up most of the Pacific Ocean north of the equator, for example, and the Great Pacific Garbage Patches in the middle of that. Um, they circulate in a certain direction because of, other factors too, but the Coriolis effect is always tugging anything in motion to be deflected to the right in the northern hemisphere. Yeah.
Are we able to track ocean circulation using garbage then?
Yeah, so if you haven't heard of this, it's a pretty huge and really depressing environmental problem where right in the middle of these big ocean gyres, both the Pacific, Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, I mean, anywhere, any of the major ocean basins that have these big gyres, everything from tiny, invisible plastic to, full scale, trash like McDonald's cups or something like
Mm.
that. They collect in the middle of them. And actually that does have a lot to do with the Coriolis effect. You're kind of trapped in the middle of the very slowly, but you're trapped in the middle of these swirling gyres, and there's no way for the plastic to get out, so it kind of collects there, and it's a big ecological and environmental problem.
Wow. Yeah. So we have this problem. So we have the Coriolis effect pushing the ocean one way in the northern hemisphere and the other way in the southern hemisphere. But the Galapagos, they sit on the equator.
Yeah.
Does having a big lump of rock in the middle of the ocean affect ocean circulation at all?
Yes, it does. And that's kind of what caught my attention many years ago, and what I think is behind a lot of the what makes the Galapagos so special and unique in terms of, just what someone like Darwin would see when he showed up and took notes. Yeah, so, just back to the Coriolis effect for a second. On the equator, technically there is no Coriolis effect, because it's positive a number in the northern hemisphere and negative a number in the southern hemisphere. And, that has to go through zero somewhere along the line. And right at the equator, the value of the Coriolis effect is absolute zero. So it's a really interesting twist that kind of requires a whole extra chapter of any ocean dynamics
Mm.
textbook just to deal with it. But yeah, I mean, that's part of what makes it very uniquely able to cause these little disruptions in the ocean circulation. So, for example, there's this really huge ocean current that actually starts over in the Western Pacific near north of Australia, near the equator, and it travels all the way across the Pacific Ocean towards South America. And this is like, a third of the circumference of the planet. This is a really long way for one ocean current to travel, and it is always there. It never goes far from the equator. It's got a name, and the name is actually the equatorial undercurrent. So by that, it implies it's on the equator and it's underwater, and it flows eastward, as I said, like from, the maritime continent all the way over to South America. The reason it can't meander is actually because of the Coriolis force. So just picture in your head like a snake trying to make its way, west to east, and if it meanders into the northern hemisphere, it's being pulled back to the right, right? Back down to the equator. And likewise, if it tries to meander into the southern hemisphere, the same Coriolis effect, but it's got the opposite sign, it pulls it to the left, right back onto the equator. So it's truly stuck there. If it tried to go in the opposite direction or go anywhere else, it kind of by mathematical um, sorcery, it just can't exist. So it's there. And that's why the placement of the Galapagos Islands on the equator and not like, say, a few degrees north or south of the equator, which easily could have happened if tectonics just in volcanism worked a little, randomness was just put it somewhere else. But, they're there on the equator. They've been there on the equator for a long time. And so the equatorial undercurrent has no choice but to smash into these islands.
Yeah. So you got this snake almost, I don't know what the word is, like ping ponging, sort of
Yeah.
being deflected constantly straight.
Yeah.
Um,
It wants to deflect. It's like weather, right?
yeah.
I'm in Colorado, you're in New York. I mean, we all kind of have our preconceived notion of which way the weather comes from, but like it all wiggles around. Nothing is always exactly what the textbook definition of your weather is. And the ocean has weather too. So it's always trying to snake around and wiggle away, but that Coriolis effect always brings it right back home to the equator.
Sure. Just very briefly, which way does storms swirl in the Galapagos? If it's in this band, or is there no twist? Is it just
There's no
downpour?
twist. Yeah, exactly. There's no, um, if you've ever looked at a global map of where like hurricanes are, for example, these are really vivid pictures that, get shown once in a while in the public sphere. But there's a notable absence of them anywhere near the equator. We've got for you in New York, you're concerned about Atlantic tropical storms or hurricanes, and there's plenty of them. And then there's even some in the South Atlantic. They're very rare. Same in the Pacific, but there's just, I think, in all of recorded history, there's been one tropical storm that, really arguably, if you could even call it this at this point, but, some remnant of it sort of crossed the equator. But that's out of hundreds of thousands of tropical storms. They just can't live there. They require the Coriolis force. And same thing with any any kind of weather, um, any kind of storm near the Galapagos Islands, they're going to be a bit different. They're just going to be big, puffy clouds. They might rain, but they'll just sort of move from east to west and they can't really swirl.
Hmm, sure. So we've got this equatorial undercurrent and it's hitting the Galapagos. The undercurrent, I assume it carries sort of nutrients towards the Galapagos.
That's right. Yeah. So, high in the high latitude ocean, that's where a lot of material enters the ocean. It sort of exchanges information with the atmosphere and then it sinks. And in the equator, near the equator in the tropical Pacific, that's where a lot of that comes back up to meet the atmosphere again, like maybe 1,000 years later.
Hmm.
And the equatorial undercurrent is one of these pipelines of that deep water um, around the world ocean, and it actually does rise up as it moves across the ocean. It rises up towards the surface, and that's exactly right. That's how a lot of the nutrients, this is obviously a colder current because if you go down in the ocean, it gets cold, but it is high in nutrient content, and it's delivering that right to where the Galapagos ecosystem really needs it to be.
Hmm. So we have this nutrient-rich water that's heading towards the Galapagos, and the Galapagos acts as almost like a fishing line that picks up the nutrients, essentially.
That's right. Yeah, it's, no one designed it as far as I'm aware, the shape or location of the Galapagos Islands, and so
Well,
it's
we could
not.
get into a philosophical debate about that, whoever designed it, you know.
Yeah, but I mean, you almost couldn't have designed it any better, to be honest, because it's not symmetrically placed on the equator, like exactly, but the biggest island, which is called Isabella, in the Galapagos, this one does truly cross the equator by an appreciable amount. And it's funny if you look at it, the shape of it's almost like a C, like a backwards C, like it's almost shaped to catch this current a little bit. And so it's really good at catching this equatorial undercurrent that, if the islands weren't there, it would just keep on carrying on and probably fizzle out right as it gets to mainland South America. But it sort of gets caught by the Galapagos and where the land happens to be and how it's shaped. And that forces some of that cold and high nutrient water to rise up to the surface, which is really key because if it just stayed underwater, might not do that much good, but it comes up into the sunlit zone and therefore photosynthesis can happen. You've got everything you need. You've got sunlight, you've got the nutrients, and so you can actually have blooms of floating plants called phytoplankton. And then that's the base of the whole marine food web.
It's a remarkable stroke of luck, or almost it's like a fishing line, isn't it, that
Yeah.
catches all those nutrients. We should probably point out that the Galapagos is located on a hotspot,
Hmm.
that right, the anomalous zone of um, heat under the crust where magma can rise up, form volcanoes, and hence form the Galapagos. The the fact that the width of the equatorial undercurrent almost matches the width of the Galapagos is kind of serendipitous.
Yes, that's a pure coincidence. The north to south width of this equatorial undercurrent, you're right, it is about exactly the width of the Galapagos Islands. And it wiggles like we've sort of invoked this imagery of a snake already. It wiggles as it moves towards the islands, and so there's certainly times when, maybe the majority of the current sort of snakes around the north side of the islands or the south side. But on average, it's definitely pointed right to where the islands actually are. And yeah, that hot spot, pure coincidence where the hot spot is. The hot spot's sort of like where the it doesn't move very much compared to the islands themselves. So it just stays there and it keeps bubbling up brand new islands, every many tens of thousands of years and kind of keeps the archipelago streaming with new islands over time. Yeah,
Yeah. So we have this buildup of phytoplankton on the western border, right? Because it's heading from west to east.
exactly.
The undercurrent is heading from west to east. So we have on the western border, we have this buildup of phytoplankton. Can you see that in the water actually? Is it greener or is it, is there a change of color of the water where it becomes nutrient rich?
Definitely. Yeah. Well, so first of all, we have satellites that orbit the Earth, and they're kind of there's a suite of satellites that we would call ocean color, sensing satellite instruments, and they have specially designed lenses basically to be able to see colors, that might color variations that might be really tricky for the unaided eye to do. But they look at how green the water is, and we know that the greener that water is, as interpreted by a satellite, that probably means there's more of this phytoplankton in there. Because when phytoplankton or even just trees, uh, when they do their photosynthesis thing, what they're really doing is creating this green pigment called chlorophyll. And that's why plants look green. And so the satellites that look down at the ocean, they're really tuned to detect the concentration of this chlorophyll pigment. And so they can tell very, very easily, like where the ocean is highly productive versus where the ocean is just kind of blue and, you know, fascinating in its own way, but not from a biological perspective, you know.
Mm.
So there's I'm not really a seagoing oceanographer as much as many of my colleagues. I do a lot of computer modeling and analysis of satellite data, but when I worked at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, we actually did send some graduate students on a cruise and to some other equatorial islands called the Gilbert Islands. Also Jarvis, which is a tiny little rock, a pebble in a stream, truly. Like this is I think a 4 square kilometer island, very, very close to the equator, like within kilometers of the equator, which is good enough. And when you go there, and I didn't do this firsthand, but this is sort of the stories that from the graduate students that came back who do things like dive and aren't afraid of sharks and jellyfish. Um, they said it was like night and day on one side of the island versus the other. Like on those western shores of these equatorial islands, it's teeming with life and sharks, and it's visibly darker or greener. There's more suspended stuff in the water that just makes it harder. The visibility is lower. But then you go over on the eastern side, and it's like clear blue, you can see forever. So satellites and humans, I feel like can pick up on this to some
Perfect for
extent.
Instagram, isn't it?
What's that?
Perfect for Instagram almost.
Right.
Social media. Yeah. So if we've got this nutrient-rich water on the western borders, that must then dictate animal behavior on the Galapagos.
Totally. Yeah. So, if you look at the distribution of just about any species in the Galapagos, it's got a very kind of obvious east-west contrast in terms of where they want to live. And this applies to, of course, the phytoplankton, which is the very lowest level of the whole marine food web, which probably isn't making a conscious decision about where they're living. They're just there because there's enough nutrients and sunlight. But then everything above that on the food chain, They tend to be hugging those western ends of the islands, like um, the penguins. There's a species of Galapagos penguins, fur seals. I'm not so sure about the marine iguanas, how they're pretty hardy, but the fur seals and the penguins, they really love the western shores of these islands because that's where their food supply is. So people have actually tracked where these penguins live by, literally going there and doing surveys and counting them. And yeah, there's a really, you won't find very many of these over on the eastern side. And if you do, they're probably pretty hungry.
Yeah, I think it was estimated roughly 70% of penguins are on the western side. Is that right? Something like
That's right. And those numbers come from a colleague of mine named Dee Bursma, who's a professor at the University of Washington and has been devoted a lot of her time in her career to understanding these penguins and their distribution and what makes them tick. So
that.
yeah.
And they must be kind of sensitive to any changes in the amount of nutrients that come to the Galapagos. So how do they respond to changes in the amount of, yeah, nutrients?
Right. Yeah. So they do. You can see it pretty directly. So there's this east-west contrast, but also, like you said, over time, they sort of whack their population numbers come and go. And a big sort of hit to the population is usually right during an El Nino event. Um, so right after an El Nino, if you go count the penguins, which Professor Bursma has done, you see I don't have the graph in front of me, but I want to say like a 75% reduction in the population of the penguins just in 1 year when a big El Nino comes along and hits the islands.
Blimey. Yeah, I remember you referring to the shrinking iguana as well in the talk the other
That as
day.
well, yes. So the iguanas seem to change their body size, not just like their stomachs are smaller because they didn't eat, but their actual bone structure, their skeletons change in size. It's like evolution on a extremely rapid rate. Um, but yeah, only when these things happen during El Niños, it's all related to everything we just talked about, that equatorial undercurrent that brings the nutrients. It kind of goes away during an El Nino event, and so it's a pretty clear reason why, I think.
Yeah, for sure. For anyone listening, the El Nino is referenced every few years because it's like, oh, it's an El Nino year,
Yep.
things are warmer. Briefly, what is an El Nino event? How does that actually occur?
Yeah, I mean at the most sort of nuts and bolts level, it's a warming of the water in the Eastern Pacific Ocean, including where the Galapagos Islands exist. To a climate scientist, it's much more than that because it involves this sort of dance between the tropical atmosphere and the tropical ocean, and they're coupled together. In other words, when water warms up in the Eastern Pacific, like it does during an El Nino, the atmosphere feels that, and the atmospheric currents change as well. But it turns out that the way that the atmospheric currents change actually feeds back onto the ocean. So it's like a snowball effect when you get this train moving in one direction, whether it started in the atmosphere or the ocean, they're gonna sort of work together and actually propel the system further into that direction. And that direction could be an El Nino, or it could be a La Nina, which is the opposite, where the inevitably the Eastern Pacific cools and everything sort of gets stronger. The equatorial undercurrent gets stronger. The trade winds get stronger. All these things sort of go hand in hand, and it lasts maybe 6 months or so when it's really in full bloom.
Yeah, I'm not sure why it's called the boy and the girl if you translate it to
It
English.
goes back to, I there was a time I was really interested in that history, and it's been a while, but it goes back to the term El Nino was sort of invoked by the Peruvian fishing uh, communities and sort of part of we didn't understand why it happened or anything like that. But what's notable about either El Nino or La Nina is it always tends to peak right around the turn of the year. So not too far from Christmas time. And El Nino, as I understand it, it could be a way to say like Christ the child, I think.
See,
And so this is a little outside my bailiwick here, but I'm pretty sure it refers to that because it, usually rears its head right as you're getting towards Christmas time. And so that was like the oceanographer's version of this phenomenon for many, many years. It would be called El Nino and La Nina, and it was really not even until just a few decades ago that we truly appreciated the fact that it's not just an ocean phenomenon, it's an atmosphere phenomenon too. And so hence this very sort of typical scientist invented acronym called ENSO, which stands for El Nino Southern Oscillation. And the Southern Oscillation part of it is the atmospheric currents
Mm.
that, so like both communities of scientists, atmospheric scientists and oceanographers had been studying that for, since like the 1800s. And then one day we realized, oh, these are actually tied together when the Southern Oscillation goes like this, it's an El Nino and vice versa. So yeah,
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's funny. Maybe La Nina is for the Virgin Mary or something. I don't know. I don't know why the girl.
maybe they just had to come up with something that's the opposite,
Oh, that's true.
I
Yeah,
don't
that's
know.
true. Could be as simple as that. Yeah. Uh, yeah, I'd like to bring us back to Darwin because we're talking about El Nino and how it affects the diversity of the wildlife on the Galapagos. And when Darwin visited in, oh, you know, it's better than me, September or October, 1835,
Hmm.
on the trusty HMS Beagle, he was obviously he founded the natural selection. Is there any chance he visited during an El Nino year? And if so, what implications would that have for his theory?
Yeah, so when I was giving a seminar at Columbia University, which I know you saw and gave you the idea for this podcast episode, it was very much in the moment while I was there at Columbia that week. um, I realized there might be an opportunity to actually answer that question, and it turns out the answers to that come from trees. And there's a couple of really well-known paleoclimatologists at Columbia, in particular, one guy named Ed Cook, who's a dendrochronologist. That just means using trees like dendro to count time, I suppose, chronology, dendrochronology. And so by looking at trees all over the world, and counting the essentially the thickness of each tree ring. If you cut a tree, cut right through the trunk, and you're going to see rings, and it turns out the width of those rings is proportional to the climate, various aspects of the climate. How much did it rain? So did it grow a lot? How warm was it? That goes one way or the other. So dendrochronologists, which is kind of a subset of paleoclimatology, they can pull together these huge networks of trees all over the world and reconstruct climate. But since El Nino affects worldwide climate, pretty much the first thing you see in one of those tree ring based reconstructions of climate is the ENSO signal. You actually see El Ninos and La Ninas sort of popping out of it because it has this global coherent impact on where it rains, where it's warm, where it's cold. And so, based on those paleo estimates, it turns out that Darwin, it seems like, visited the Galapagos at the tail end of not just a La Nina, but like a 2 year long, which is kind of rare, but like a protracted 2 year long La Nina, which I think is really interesting because that probably means that the ecosystem, the way that it responds to La Ninas now, the ecosystem was really ramped up and in full bloom on display for whoever would visit at that time, which is just another one of the, pretty much on brand for the Galapagos because everything about the Galapagos is just this crazy coincidence that really didn't have to happen that way. But if he had, I would, th give me a little rope here, but I would say that if Darwin had visited during a El Nino year, it probably wouldn't have looked that interesting. The
Mhm.
penguins would be gone, the phytoplankton wouldn't be as abundant, and
Iguanas would be tiny.
right,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, exactly. I might be a little bit pretentious here and maybe quote what Darwin said about the Galapagos, if I may.
Yeah.
He said that by far the most remarkable feature in the natural history of this archipelago is that the different islands, to a considerable extent, are inhabited by a different set of beings. I have never dreamed that islands about 50 or 60 miles apart, and most of them in sight of each other, formed of precisely the same rocks, placed under a quite similar climate, rising to a nearly equal height, would have been differently tenanted. So
Mm.
I want to probably finish by asking, how important are the Galapagos for the birth and our understanding then of evolution?
I mean, I would say they were very important. I've read bits and pieces of Darwin's work, and it's pretty clear that he was heavily influenced by what he saw in the Galapagos. And that diversity of the life across the islands, and that quote you just read that sort of speaks to the um, just the isolate the aspect of, even if it's just kilometers apart, isolating species from one another will cause them to go in different directions just because, one feature or one trait happens to be just a little bit more advantageous on one island than another, and away it goes. They diverge. Yeah, it's really interesting. The isolation stuff, that's another thing that I think the Galapagos is just kind of well constructed for. You've got a lot of small islands, you've got a lot of opportunity and reason for there to be life there for all the reasons we just, discussed. But then they're separated too in dozens of tiny little islands. So it's
Exactly.
also, I think I would put in a plug that it's important to conserve places like this because, we've all heard that climate change isn't going to be great for the marine ecosystem, and that's true in large part all around the world. But there might be some tiny little spots where perhaps Mother Nature is giving you a little extra running start. The Galapagos is right there. It's got this equatorial undercurrent that's probably not just going to go away anytime soon. So, you know, I I would say these places are really important to conserve for the future. They may even provide opportunities for reseeding other more devastated marine ecosystems around the world.
Absolutely. Kris, thank you very much for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. And any aspiring geology student or undergraduate, please go out and buy Kris's book, Physical Oceanography and Climate, fundamental textbook for exploring the physics of oceans and our atmosphere.
Thanks a lot, Jack.
I appreciate it. Thank you.